All right, number 13 here is a proof. We're given that W is the midpoint of UX and UV, and we want to prove that angle U is congruent to angle X. Now when we do a proof, we want to go step by step and start with what's given and then work our way and show what we're trying to prove. In this one we have a couple triangles in the figure, and we want to prove that two things are congruent. So when we notice this, a lot of times what we want to do is prove the triangles are congruent, and then once we know the triangles are congruent, we'll know those corresponding parts are congruent. So what we'll do is we'll start off by writing the given, and so we know that W is the midpoint of UX and UV. And that's given. And that's how we start. We always start with the given. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use that given and see if we can use any terms in there to come up with anything else we know to be true. So there is a term in there, the word midpoint. And so what we want to do is we want to use that word midpoint and that term midpoint to figure out to see if we can figure out anything about this figure. So midpoint means it's going to split those segments into two congruent parts. So the first part says it's the midpoint of UX. So here's UX, and we want to show that it's the midpoint of that. So we want to mark that those are congruent. It's also the midpoint of VY, and so these two are going to be congruent. And so we can say that segment UW is congruent to segment WX because of the definition of midpoint. At the same time, we can say VY is congruent to, not VY, VW is congruent to WY. And that's because of the definition of midpoint. Because a midpoint splits a segment into two congruent parts. And now we have two sides of one triangle congruent to two sides of the other. By looking at this figure here, we see that we have these angles here. They're vertical angles. So anytime we have vertical angles, we know that vertical angles are congruent. So we can say angle UWV is congruent to angle YWX. YWX. And we have those marked congruent. That's because vertical angles are congruent. So now we can state that these triangles are congruent. So we're almost there, because that's what I mentioned earlier. If we can show the triangles are congruent, we can then show that corresponding parts are congruent. And so we know that these triangles are congruent by our figure, and marking it, we see that they're congruent by side angle side. We want to make sure we write this congruent statement correctly. So we'll write triangle, and we'll write UWV. UWV is congruent to triangle. And we have to be careful. UW, the thing that we mentioned first here, UW, is right here. That's the one tick mark. So we want to go where the other one tick mark is. We're going to go XW. So that's congruent to XW, and then we just go up to Y. And so those two triangles are congruent. And now we're to our last step. Since the triangles are congruent, corresponding angles are congruent. We notice that even in our statement here, U corresponds with X, so we can say angle U is congruent to angle X. And we can say that by the definition of congruent triangles, or we can just put CPCTC, and that stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And that's the proof. We used congruent triangles to show that their corresponding parts were congruent.